For you listening, some Supreme Court cases just echo through history, and few resonate as profoundly as Brown v. Board of Education. Think about it, a single decision in 1954 that declared state-sponsored segregation in public schools unconstitutional. It wasn't just like a legal ruling, it was a seismic shift that changed the very fabric of American society.
Absolutely. And for you to understand its impact, remember it struck right at the heart of the separate but equal doctrine. That had been the deeply flawed foundation of segregation for decades, ever since Plessy v. Ferguson back in 1896.
Plessy, right. That doctrine essentially allowed for segregation, didn't it? As long as the facilities were supposedly equal.
Supposedly being the key word, yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this for you. Today on the Deep Dive, our mission is to really understand Brown v. Board, but not just on its own. We want to explore the legal landscape that led up to it, those earlier cases that, while maybe they didn't topple segregation overnight, they laid crucial groundwork. Kind of like laying the foundation for, well, an inevitable shift.
Exactly. We'll be looking at how the legal arguments and, importantly, the factual findings in these preceding cases really illuminated the inherent inequality of segregation itself. It helped the courts finally recognize it.
And for this deep dive, you should know we've gathered a range of sources. Of course, we'll be digging into the landmark Brown v. Board decision itself, but we'll also revisit Plessy v. Ferguson, the case that, really set the stage.
And Sweat v. Painter, too. That one's critical. Our primary focus for you today is firmly on that road to Brown, understanding those crucial steps along the way.
So for you to grasp the journey, where do we begin? It has to be Plessy, right? Plessy v. Ferguson. That's where this whole separate but equal idea really got its legal footing.
Precisely. And for you to understand the context, you have to remember the 14th Amendment, ratified way back in 1868. It had this powerful promise, the Equal Protection Clause.
Equal protection, yeah.
Congress even tried to act on it with the Civil Rights Act of 1875, aiming to outlaw segregation in public places. But the Supreme Court unfortunately struck that down. They said it overstepped, tried to regulate private conduct. So for you, that ruling kind of created a void where state-sponsored segregation could really take root and flourish.
Which then paved the way for Plessy. Okay, remind us of the specifics there so you have the full picture.
Right. So in 1890, Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act. It mandated equal but separate train cars for white and black passengers. Homer Plessy, who, as you might know, was of mixed race, deliberately violated this law. He did it specifically to challenge its constitutionality.
So he was intentionally testing the law.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
His actions set the stage for the big legal battle over segregation.
And for you to understand the outcome, it led to the infamous separate but equal doctrine. What exactly did the court say in Plessy? How do they justify it?
Well, the core, and frankly, the really flawed idea in Plessy, for you to understand, was this assertion that legal equality could somehow coexist with blatant social inequality. The court basically said segregation was okay, legally, as long as the facilities provided were, of equal quality.
But how did they reason that?
Their reasoning was quite telling. They argued the 14th Amendment guaranteed legal equality, not social equality. And therefore, the Constitution couldn't really interfere with social prejudices. They even stated quite starkly, if one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them on the same plane.
Wow. So for you listening, according to that logic, as long as the train cars looked the same, segregation was fine, regardless of the message of inferiority it sent.
Pretty much, regardless of the lived reality of unequal treatment that Black Americans faced every single day. That was the prevailing view, yes. But it's crucial for you to remember Justice Harlan's powerful dissent. He argued very forcefully that segregation inherently violated the Constitution because its very purpose and effect were to enforce inequality based on race. He saw the Constitution as colorblind, a fundamental principle that segregation just directly contradicted.
A lone voice of reason back then, wasn't he? For you, it's sobering to think how deeply entrenched that separate but equal idea became for so long after Plessy. But eventually, the legal landscape started to shift, right? Let's talk about Sweat v. Painter. That case began to challenge this foundation.
Yes, Sweat v. Painter, decided in 1950, is a really significant step on the road to Brown for you to understand. It involved Herman Sweat, a black man who was denied admission to the University of Texas School of Law solely because of his race.
Just flat out denied based on race.
Yep, he sued, arguing it violated the 14th Amendment, directly challenging a separate but equal, but specifically in higher education this time.
And for you to see the connection to Brown, the court had to grapple with that same doctrine again. What did they find in Sweatt that started to create those crucial cracks?
Well, the Supreme Court actually did a really detailed examination for you. They compared the University of Texas Law School, the established one, with this hastily created Texas State University for Negroes Law School. The state argued, hey, we're providing separate but equal. Right.
Right, the usual argument.
But the court looked far beyond just the physical buildings and books. They found that tangible factors, the facilities, the curricula, the faculty qualifications, they just weren't equal, not even close.
Yeah.
So that was a clear failure, even by the Plessy standard itself.
Okay, so even on the surface level, it failed the test. That seems like a pretty clear violation, even of the flawed Plessy's standard. So for you, it highlights how rarely separate actually meant equal in practice, doesn't it?
It absolutely did. But here's where it gets really interesting, and where you can start to see the direct path to Brown. The court went further. They recognized there were also intangible factors, things that could never be equalized in a segregated setting.
Intangible factors, like what?
Things like the reputation of the faculty, the influence and connections of the alumni network, the prestige and standing of the institution within the legal community. You couldn't just replicate those overnight in a new separate school. The court understood that a legal education wasn't just about textbooks and classrooms.
Okay. So for you, the court started to acknowledge that equality wasn't just about like checking off boxes for physical resources. It was about the whole educational experience, the opportunities, the societal standing it gives you. This feels like a pivotal shift in thinking.
Exactly. Sweatt marked a crucial turning point for you. It showed that true equality in education goes beyond the physical stuff to include these intangibles, like reputation and prestige. And this idea directly undermined the whole separate but equal facade. It suggested segregation itself inherently created inequality, especially in fields critical for, getting ahead, leadership.
And that understanding became central to the arguments later in Brown.
Absolutely central. Yes, it paved the way.
Which brings us directly to Brown v. Board itself. For you listening, Linda Brown's story in Topeka, Kansas, it's such a powerful and, personal example of the real-world impact of segregation on just a young child.
It really is. As you know, Linda Brown was denied admission to the Sumner School. That was the white-only elementary school, much closer to her home. Instead, she had to make this far longer, more difficult journey every day to attend the all-black Monroe School. Just think about that daily reality for a moment.
And for you to understand the legal context, this was happening even though Kansas law only permitted segregation in elementary schools in cities over a certain size, right? It didn't mandate it statewide.
That's right. Yet Topeka chose to maintain these separate schools. It really highlights how ingrained segregation was, even where it wasn't strictly required by state law.
So the Browns felt this was wrong, a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. And they sued.
They did. They took action and sued the Board of Education of Topeka, directly challenging the legality of segregation in public education itself.
And what did the lower federal district court find for you? It's interesting because they seem to acknowledge the harm, but still upheld segregation.
Yeah, the district court actually agreed that segregation in public education had a detrimental, meaning harmful, effect upon black children. That's a significant finding for you to note right there.
They admitted it caused harm.
Yes, but they ultimately denied relief. They stubbornly clung to the separate but equal doctrine from Plessy. Why? Because they found that the tangible resources, the buildings, transportation, curricular, teacher qualifications, were, in their assessment, substantially equal.
Wow. So for you, they were still stuck on that purely physical comparison, even while admitting the real harm being done psychologically to black children. That must have been incredibly frustrating.
It absolutely was. And that's precisely why the Browns, recognizing the fundamental injustice, took their case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the court, thankfully, recognized the national significance of this issue and agreed to hear it.
And they combined it with other similar cases?
Yes, a crucial decision for you. Okay. They combined Brown with similar cases from other states, South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, all facing the exact same issue. It acknowledged this wasn't just a Topeka problem, it was widespread, systemic across the country.
Now, for you, we can really see the direct parallels emerging between Sweatt and Brown, can't we? Both cases centered on the denial of educational opportunities based solely on race. Both relied on the 14th Amendment's promise of equality.
Absolutely. But the crucial link for you is how the legal focus continued to sharpen and evolve. In Brown, the plaintiffs argued, building directly on the logic from Sweatt, that even if those tangible resources were technically equal, which, as we said, was rarely the case anyway,
Right, rarely true in reality.
the very act of state-sponsored segregation inflicted profound and lasting intangible harms on black children. This was the key evolution in the legal argument that ultimately proved decisive.
What kind of intangible harms were they emphasizing in the Brown case for you? What specifically resonated with the Supreme Court?
The arguments for Brown were incredibly powerful for you to understand. They highlighted how segregation inherently reduced the benefits of education for black children simply because of their race. They pointed out that even if physical resources were meticulously equalized, the act of state-sponsored separation created and relentlessly reinforced feelings of superiority in white students and, critically, deep feelings of inferiority in black students.
Feelings of inferiority.
Yes. This segregation, they argued, placed what they powerfully termed a badge of inferiority directly and unjustly upon black children.
That badge of inferiority, it's such a potent image for you to consider. It really speaks volumes about the psychological and emotional damage, doesn't it? Damage that went far beyond just the physical condition of school buildings.
Precisely. The legal arguments in Brown also emphasize for you how segregation fundamentally undermined motivation, how it actively damaged the healthy formation of identity in black students. It wasn't just about separate classrooms. It was about their very sense of self, their place, their potential in American society. The court began to truly grasp the profound social and psychological costs.
And what was the Board of Education's defense in Brown for you? They were still trying to argue for separate but equal, weren't they? Despite all this growing evidence of its flaws.
They were. Yeah, their arguments for you often focus on the idea that equal treatment didn't necessarily mean identical treatment. They suggested providing an educational environment where students felt most comfortable learning, which was really a thinly veiled argument implying, separation was best for everyone's
Comfort over equality.
Exactly. They also pointed back to the supposed equality of tangible facilities in Topeka, trying to distinguish their situation from the clear disparities in Sweatt. And, they raised concerns about federalism, local control over education, and the practical challenges of integration, especially with existing segregated housing patterns.
It's striking for you to see how they tried to prioritize this idea of comfort and local control over the fundamental constitutionally protected right to equal opportunity for all children regardless of race.
It is. But the Supreme Court, in its landmark and importantly unanimous decision in Brown, fundamentally rejected that entire line of flawed logic for you. They declared unequivocally that segregation in public schools directly and irreconcilably violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the very bedrock of equal justice under law.
And the reasoning behind that unanimous decision is so incredibly important for you to understand. What were the key points the court emphasized that finally overturned Plessy in education?
Well, the court stated, without any ambiguity for you, that public education was the very foundation of good citizenship in a democracy, absolutely essential for individual success and societal progress. They firmly declared that access to education was a right which must be made available to all on equal terms.
Available to all on equal terms.
Yes. Then, and this is crucial for you, even while acknowledging the tangible factors in Topeka might have been substantially equal on paper, they focused intently on those critical intangible effects that Sweatt had begun to illuminate. They stated unequivocally that separating children solely based on race generated a profound and lasting feeling of inferiority in the hearts and minds of African American children, a feeling that could never be erased just by having similar buildings or textbooks.
So for you, they directly and powerfully addressed the psychological and social harm, the harm the lower court even admitted existed, recognizing that this harm was inherent to the act of segregation itself.
Exactly. The court definitively concluded for you that in the vital realm of public education, the long-standing doctrine of separate but equal simply had no legitimate place. They declared clearly and forcefully, separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
Inherently unequal, that's the key phrase.
That's the core holding. And this was a direct, undeniable departure from the entire discriminatory premise of Plessy v. Ferguson. And as the Brown decision itself explicitly noted for you, it directly echoed the powerful dissenting view Justice Harlan had articulated decades earlier.
It's truly incredible for you to think about the moral clarity and the legal courage of that unanimous decision. It fundamentally changed the course of American history, didn't it? Even though, well, the struggle for true equality continued long after.
It absolutely did. And for you to fully appreciate the moment, while Brown v. Board itself focused squarely on overturning segregation specifically within public education, the groundwork meticulously laid by earlier cases, particularly Sweatt v. Painter's crucial recognition of the profound impact of intangible inequalities, the groundwork was absolutely critical. It shaped the legal arguments and ultimately led to that powerful, unanimous holding in Brown. It wasn't a sudden legal earthquake,
Right.
It was a gradual but relentless progression of legal understanding, a growing recognition of the inherent injustice.
So for you listening, the key takeaway here is that Brand v. Board wasn't some isolated legal thunderbolt out of nowhere. It was, in fact, the powerful culmination of decades of persistent legal challenges. Challenges that gradually, methodically expose the fundamental fallacy of separate but equal, especially highlighting those deeply damaging intangible harms that cases like Sweatt began to bring into the clear light of legal scrutiny.
Precisely put, it powerfully demonstrates for you how legal precedent can build and evolve over time, how seemingly smaller legal victories challenging flawed doctrines can, over decades, shift the entire legal landscape and pave the way for truly monumental, transformative change in the pursuit of justice and equality.
This really makes you think, doesn't it? For you, considering all the ongoing conversations and debates we have about equality and opportunity in our society today, what are the modern intangible factors that might still be creating significant disparities, even without explicit state-sponsored segregation like back then? It's definitely a crucial question for all of us to, continue to reflect deeply upon.
Absolutely. And for you, it just underscores the enduring power and importance of legal precedent and the continuing need to critically examine and challenge inequalities in all their complex, evolving forms. We need to keep working to ensure that the promise of equal protection under the law becomes a lived reality for every single person.